In the previous video, I explained the architecture of the GUI framework, the base class, GUI widget, GUI button, and GUI text box. In today's video, I'll explain the GUI Rectangle, GUI Toggle, GUI Icon, and GUI Highlighter. The GUI Rectangle is used to represent the two-dimensional position and size of a GUI control in GUI spatial coordinates. A GUI element's central position is on the screen between the values -1 to +1 along both the x and y axes. If it is outside of these values, then its central position is off-screen. For size, the value 1 for the x and y coordinates means the control is the exact same size as the screen. If it is on 0.5 on the x-coordinate and 0.5 on the y-coordinate, it is a quarter of the screen size. Using this system prevents us from having to define positions and sizes in screen pixels, which is not intuitive. We return to the Scale and Position function of the GUI widget base class to see how the GUI rectangle is used. The rectangle position is multiplied by the scale of the parent's model, so it stays in proportion to it. We then add to the parent's position, so it is in relative proximity to it as well. The parent's position is the reference position of its children. Remember that the GUI root is always at the root of the GUI tree. The screen is to the GUI root as the GUI root is to its children, and so forth. We then set the scale of the model by the rectangle dimensions multiplied by the parent scale to keep its size in proportion. Let's look at an example. In the main menu screen, the root is at position 0 on x and y, with a length of 1 and a height of 1. The highlighter's position is 0 on x and y relative to its parent, the root. Its size is 0.1872 on x and 0.0648 on y. Therefore, it will be approximately 18% of the size of the parent in the x dimension and approximately 6% of the size in the y dimension. The GUI Toggle class is used for opposing interactions, such as increasing or decreasing the music volume level in the Options menu. In the Options screen, the elements with one arrow to each side of text are toggles. The Display Mode toggle alternates from windowed to full screen. The arrows are buttons using text arrow characters. The text between them is changed when the option is toggled. The text to the left of the leftmost arrow is the heading text. In the header file, we see that the text ID that is used for the heading text and the colors for the foreground and shadow text. All the elements have their own rectangles, since they are all separate components. The arrow size determines the font size of the arrow characters. I used this variable because I wanted the size to be independent of the other text size. In the constructor, we set the default arrow size and set the control's type to toggle box. In the initialize function, we set the aforementioned variables, then load the default GUI model and a black texture. We aren't going to use the model for anything aside from the transformation values, so the model visible variable is currently always false. We add the left and right arrow button as children and cache access to them for use later. The first variable is the identifier. The second is the rectangle that delimits the area of this control. The third is the language string identifier. The fourth is the font type for the arrow characters. The fifth is the font size of the arrow characters. The sixth and seventh variables are the foreground and backing color of the arrow characters respectively. We pass in the left and right arrow textures for the GUI mask model, but they are not being rendered, so it's superfluous. We then pass in the sound effect name for the mouse cursor intersection. We leave the selection sound effect as an empty string, since I don't want a sound effect playing when the toggle is selected. We will ignore the final parameter for now. The previous video in the series explains the GUI button in more detail. We now add the header and toggleable text. The first parameter is the identifier. The second is the rectangle that delimits the area. The third is the language string ID. You will notice that the toggleable text references an empty string by default. This is changed in the GUI screen class that controls it. The fourth is the style of justification that we desire. The fifth is the name of the font. The sixth is the size of the text. The seventh sets the model to invisible. The eighth sets the text as static, which means the string's characters will not be updated. The last two are for the background and foreground color of the text. Process message checks if the pointers for the left and right arrow buttons are valid before processing the message passed through from the GUI root. If the mouse is over one of the buttons and the primary released message is sent through, the selected boolean will be set to true. This will allow us to use the functionality that is tied to it in the GUI screen class that handles this toggle. GUI Icon is for displaying an image. It is a very simple class. It just adds an initialize function to the base functionality of the widget. The constructor sets the control type to icon. The initialize function sets the identifier and rectangle, then parses in a model and sets the texture for it separately. Unlike in the previous examples, this model is always visible because that is the sole point of this class. The original proportions boolean enforces the configuration's file's originally set proportions of an icon when it is set to true. We return to the scale and position function again to see how exactly this is enforced. For simplicity, we assume bar inverse proportion is 1. When we set the y part of the scale of the model, we use the x scale of the parent rather than the y scale in the usual case. We then divide it by the originally calculated y proportion so that it keeps its original proportions always. Let's look at an example. Here we see how the face icon stretches with the screen when the original proportions boolean is false. Now we see how it always stays in the original proportion despite how we scale the screen. One of the consequences of this is that the icon might overlap another element that it otherwise would not. The GUI Highlighter is an icon that is used to visually specify another GUI control. Focus to null and sets the control type. The Activate function sets the position of the highlighter to the position of its focus widget. It then ensures that it is visible. The Scale and Position function sets the position of the highlighter's model using the rectangle of the focus widget when the focus pointer is not null. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.